Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today on another quick live landscape edition. So we're going to be editing, let's bring it up on screen. We're going to be editing this shot. So this is one I took some years back. So that's after a little stab at it yesterday. And that's how it was coming out of camera. So a number of issues, obviously, it's a bit hazy and misty. You can also see I wasn't paying attention to my camera settings because it was shot at f1.8, which is not really a traditional aperture for this kind of shot. But the reason why it was hurried was that I wanted to catch the rain clouds before it was moving in really quick. So I wanted to get these rain clouds before I kind of lost the sun on this rock in front and so on. So not the best camera settings, but still fortunately a nice sharp picture that we can work with. Now this one, the file is also up for download. So if you want to download it and just have a muck around yourself, you can do so. The link is in the description of the Facebook and YouTube post as well. So hello to everyone on Facebook and YouTube. Don't forget to tell us where you're listening from as well. It's always nice to know. Okay, so let's turn off our before and after view and let's go to one that a variant that is not edited. First of all, because that makes sense. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is crop this because, again, hurried shot, the cropping. I think I shot this out of a car window, actually, pretty much, or just kind of fell out the car and took a shot as quick as possible. So I'm going to get rid of this kind of distraction on the left and then crop roughly something like that. Now, also, if you have any questions, don't forget to put them in the comments as well. So I'm happier with that cropping right now, says he, adjusting it once more. So now we can dig in a little bit and make some adjustments. It looks slightly off center. I'm just wondering if actually I can use the keystone tool just to kind of straighten it a bit. So if I kind of align on either side here, I actually didn't try this yesterday, so this might be a really bad idea. But if I do that and say apply, does it work? No. So that's probably why I didn't do it yesterday. So instead of doing that, let's just do a good traditional old rotation. So if I want to tweak it a little bit, I tend to just click into the angle box and then use my shift and cursor keys just to jog it a little bit. So I'm just going to go up 0.3 degrees just to get something closer to that. So that looks good, I think. Okay, so now we can start to deal with exposure and all those kinds of things. Now looking at it straight away, we can see it's kind of too bright here. It's a little bit flat on the hazy side. It's probably too warm as well because I want the kind of blue thundery cloud coming out a little bit more. So first thing I'm going to do is just cool it down ever so slightly as well to something like that, I'd say. Now exposure, oh actually we had some adjustments here. Let's just fix those kinds of things. Sorry, I thought I was on a totally unedited one. It wasn't cropped, but it had some editing. Let's just make sure. Let's just reset those bits and pieces. Okay, so that's how it looked out of camera. So you can see obviously much flatter and hazier and so on. So apologies for that. So I've just warmed it up or taken it a little bit cooler from its warmer start point. So let's go to something like that. I feel is better. Now in terms of its kind of lack of contrast and muddiness, the easiest thing we can do is look at our levels tool. And if we look at either end of our histogram, we can see that there's no information kind of up this end on the highlights, and we're kind of really not much information down on the shadow ends. So that's going to give us a relatively flat image. Now exposure wise, it's probably erring on the side of underexposure. So I'm just going to lift it up a little bit and then hit auto on my levels. And that's going to snap in my shadow and highlight points to either end. So that's instantly going to give me much better contrast, as you can see. So if I reset the levels tool, that's how it was before. Hit auto on the little button, the little magic wand, and that's looking much better. So that's cleaned up a lot of the base contrast, but I can still do a bit more to improve it. So I'm going to add in some additional contrast as well. and also a little bit of clarity, which is going to help our mid-tone contrast somewhat. Now at this point it's getting a little bit too harsh because our highlights are getting a bit out of control. So now it's going to be a little juggling act. I'm just going to pull the highlight point out a bit and see what we can do with the high dynamic range tool. So immediately I'm going to pull the highlights down, and I'm not going to be afraid to go quite a lot. And also I'm going to pull the whites down as well. And probably, again, as I said, it's a balancing act. I might take the exposure down a bit more and then bring up my brightness. And what that will do, the brightness will lift the midtones, whereas the exposure is going to affect the whole image. So by bringing the exposure down a bit, then I'm going to get some control back in my highlights and bring up the brightness to lift the midtones a bit. So now this is looking much more balanced. Now when it comes to the shadows, this is probably getting a bit too dark. So now we can correct, if you like, that end of the histogram. So first of all, just on my levels, I just pull that back out just to make sure we're not clipping, and that's already pretty good. Okay, so I'm happy with, generally, we're not done yet, generally happy with the balance of kind of this area. This bit might still be a bit too bright, but I think I'll deal with that with the local adjustment because everything else is kind of balanced quite nicely as well. So what I want to do is focus a bit more on this guy. So we kind of want a bit of a vignette, but probably something a bit more capable than the basic vignetting tool. Because if we try and vignette here, it's kind of making this area too dark, which I don't want. So what we're trying to do instead is we're building a radial mask. So if we make a new empty adjustment layer, like so, we grab our radial mask icon, and then we're going to draw where we think our radial mask should sit. So I'm going to put it, kind of pull it over this way a little bit more and make sure it's nice and feathered. So I don't want this area to get too dark, but as there's some good moody clouds in this area, then I can afford to have this slightly more random shape. So let's try that. M on your keyboard to hide and show the mask. And then now we can experiment with what's going to work best for changing the tones. So I'm going to hazard a guess that brightness is probably going to be better, because if we go for exposure, it's maybe a little bit too unrealistic and dramatic. So brightness will bring those tones down, but it's not going to darken up my shadows too much. And as it's getting a little bit dark in this spot, on the same layer with our radial mask, then I can bring up the blacks, because that's just going to lift those darkest areas a bit, and maybe a tiny bit of shadows as well. Now that's still giving me that darkening effect. So if we turn on the adjustment layer on and off like so, that works quite nicely. And I'm pretty happy with that. Now the only sort of two other things I want to deal with, I would like to see if we can get even more out of these clouds, because if we kind of go in close, then we can see there's lots of, you know, it was a real downpour, like a real quick sudden downpour. So it was nice to be able to try and get as much detail out of that as possible. So that's one more thing to do. And the second thing, this is still a little bit bright in this area. So it's kind of where you end up looking. So I want to try and deal with this separately. One other thing I might just take, if I go back to saturation, overall, I'm just going to take the saturation down a little bit so it's a bit more muted. Okay, so let's deal with clouds and then this area once more. So first of all, I'm going to do this area, I think. Now it's a bit too bright, but what tool's going to work the best to bring that down? So let's first of all name this layer. So this was our radial mask, so we don't forget what it is. And let's make a new filled layer. So a filled layer is like an adjustment layer, so it's going to affect the whole photo. But we're filling the layer just so we can dial in our adjustment. So for this area, I'm just going to kind of focus my eyes around this spot. And we're going to try a few different adjustments. So I can probably bring the exposure down a touch, but I don't want to go too far because then we're going to lose detail in here. So we can probably bring brightness down and also the highlights to some extent as well. So now if we turn this layer off, again still focusing on this area, it's kind of brought it much more in control. So that's probably about the darkest I'd want to bring it. So if we zoom in, it's got a bit of brightness to it, but it's just taken that edge off it a little bit. So now I just want to concentrate that on this particular area. So the way we do that is we're going to right click on this layer and get rid of the mask, but it's still got those underlying adjustments in place, which works nicely. And now we can grab our brush and draw back in where we want to have that. Now to make sure this doesn't come in too quickly, we're going to keep our flow nice and low. And the lower the flow, the longer it takes to build up the adjustments. So as I'm brushing back and forth, it's just gradually, very, very slowly, layering in my adjustments that I just did. And then when I feel it's all right, then we can stop there. Now this mask will be quite faint. So if I press M, you can see where the mask is now. And if we turn this layer off and then back on, and we can just do a little bit more down here and just on that tree line along there. Now you can see what that mask is doing. So it's subtle, it's just taking it down by a little tiny bit, just because I thought it was a bit too bright. Okay, so the last thing that I want to do, or I think it's the last thing, is just to get a bit more drama in these clouds. So let's label this high light control, like so. And let's make another filled adjustment layer, and we're going to call this dramatic clouds. Now I probably wouldn't label these quite so extensively, but this way you and I know what's going on. So how can we make these more dramatic? Well, we could probably make them a bit darker, a touch. Then it's got that nice moody, angry cloud look going on. We could probably add a bit more clarity. So that's maximum clarity. So that brings out the contrast a bit more. So let's do that. Maybe not all the way up. And could we do anything else? Maybe we could make the blacks a bit darker, but that's not having much effect. So maybe we can make the shadows a bit darker as well. So that'll make these darker areas more pronounced. And the highlights are fine, I think, but I just want to see what happens if I bring the whites down, or highlights. Not a great deal. So I'm going to leave those alone. So now again, we've dialed in our adjustment. So let's right click and clear our mask. And we're going to grab our brush and we're going to do a similar thing. Going to make it not quite as soft. And now we can just gradually skim in this area of the clouds that we want. Now if it's happening too quickly, you can turn your flow down. So if my flow was up here and I started brushing in, see it's happening really quick. So let's undo that step. So if we turn our flow down nice and low, like so, and it's just right click to bring up that panel, remember. If we do that, then it just gives us the opportunity to gradually brush in. Oh, shush Alexa. Sorry, Alexa's piping up in the background, interrupting me as usual. So then now we can just do a bit more of that. So if we turn this layer off and back on, then that's just picked that up like so. One thing, if I go back to this layer, it's a little bit too bright here, so I'm going to just choose my highlight layer again, make my brush a bit smaller and just darken this little patch down a bit as well. So that was a bit too bright for my liking. Just checking your questions before we feel if there's anything else that we can do. Nice to see lots of international people. Oh, that's a good question from Rick. Sometimes in dark areas there's some noise. Is it possible to just denoise that area? Absolutely. So if we look closely at the clouds, it's probably not too bad actually. But if we wanted to, I can see a tiny bit of grain. Let's go to 200% so we don't have to squint, or 300%. So we can see there's a bit of grain just creeping in. So because we've made that darker and up the contrast. So what you could do, who was asking, that was Rick once more. What we could do, Rick, is also on that same layer, is just bump up the noise reduction. So if we look in the layers, if we go to the background, you can see we've got our standard noise reduction applied, which generally the defaults work great. But as we're pushing this raw file a bit harder, then we could also decide, well, on this layer, my dramatic clouds layer, we could actually up the noise reduction a bit as well. So if I increase that, the luminance slider, then that's going to smooth that out like so. We could even go to 100 And if I just click and hold on luminance, you can see before and after. Now, I don't know how easy that is to see on a live stream, but again, this raw file is up for download, so it's something you could try as well. So just by bumping up the noise reduction on that area, it's cleaned up the noise. So if we look down in the darker areas around here, so if we turn, long press on luminance, I can see a bit of grain and noise creeping in. If I let go, then that just smooths it out a little bit as well. So that's actually a great follow-up question. So yes, you can apply noise reduction anywhere locally, because if we go to this area, there's no reason why I want to add more noise reduction here, because this was shot at ISO 80, so it's very low noise anyway. Even though it's an old camera, it's still super nice quality. So I wouldn't want to up the noise reduction there, because then I'm going to potentially reduce some of my detail. But adding more noise reduction here makes perfect sense. What I do want to do on the background though, let's make this tool a bit bigger now, medium, so we've got more layers. What I do want to do on the background is add a little bit of structure. That would just help pop out those nice sharp details in the rocks and so on. Good question from Joe. Why didn't I use AutoMask to work on the sky? Because I don't really want it to cut perfectly around that edge, because then what you probably find is that it would be very noticeable that I'd made a change to the sky. So if we look at this layer, and if we look at our grayscale mask, see, that's the current mask we have on the sky. So it's super soft and fluffy. So by turning that back off, M, like so, there's not really any indication that there's been some work on the sky. So if we'd done a perfect auto mask around it, first of all, it would have taken me longer. And secondly, you probably would then see quite easily that there was some kind of additional work going on. So don't always think that you've got to be like a laser cut around something. Often if it's nice and soft, then it looks more natural. But sometimes there's definitely a case for making an auto mask as well. Sometimes instead of auto masking, you might find that refining a mask makes more sense as well. So if we did refine mask on this and cranked it up to the max, then what you'll find is that it will hunt or like suck around the edges like so. So if we do that instead, then that would give us a different result. So if I said apply like so, let's turn the mask off, you can see it's kind of following a bit more accurately as well. But if we say undo refine mask, then it's ever such a slight difference. So I would favor, Joe, if you wanted to have a more accurate mask, is start with something like that, and then refine mask will again give you something a lot more believable as well. But great question, good stuff. You're welcome, Rick, definitely. It's and the same can be applied with sharpening as well. So let's say we wanted to sharpen up this area a bit more, then it doesn't need it on this shot because it's in focus and it's a great lens, which helps. But if we wanted to sharpen up this area more, then I would do that on a layer, because we wouldn't want to sharpen the clouds because that's going to accentuate the noise. So think about that. You can also do the same with sharpening as well. What about increasing the greens? Is it a good idea? Depends really. I wanted this one a bit more muted, but if we go to our background layer and use either of the color editor modes, doesn't matter, and click on the greens, that's more ready actually, isn't it? That's definitely a ready green. Let's just reset you for a second. So there's probably quite a heavy red tint from the sand in the ground. There's a bit more green. Then we could play around with the brightness, saturation, whatever. But I personally like it a bit more muted. But as you guys have access to the raw file, you can change to your heart's content. Could be my cell phone, but the grey sky looks a little magenta. Let's just have a look at our numbers. Possibly a tiny bit, but if you wanted to, if we go to dramatic clouds again, for color correction, we could either use our color editor, or with our color balance tool, you could chuck in whatever color tint you wanted. So if you wanted it less magenta, we could kind of go in the opposite direction. If you wanted it, you know, whatever color you want, obviously we'd probably mask the whole sky a bit better, but you could easily, with the color balance tool, correct any color cast you wanted. Or with the white balance tool, we could do a separate white balance for the clouds if you wish. So the choice is yours. Who was asking that? That was, sorry, I missed your name, Angela. So, but again, download the file and make it up. And try yourself, I meant to say. The image is not green enough across the board, Barry was saying. Or again, you could go to the color balance tool and then you could grab, if we go back to the background layer, if you feel there's too much of something, then obviously you've got the white balance tool. But if you think there's an overriding cast, then you can just go to the opposite of that, for example. So you can push this color tint around in any direction, and that's just like putting a filter across the front of the lens. But if something is overall too cold, you could warm it up a little bit if you wanted. If you feel it needs to be cooler, we could go in this direction, and so on. So the choice is yours. More of a technical question, does Capture make use of a GPU or even an eGPU? Yes, it's actually making use of a eGPU as we speak, and also the two other GPUs that are in this computer. So yes, it does. So if you do have an eGPU connected, then it will pick that up, no problem. And if you've got dual graphics cards, it will make use for them, and so on. So that just helps on things like you know, zooming to 100%, moving around the image, adjusting sliders. Export times are dramatically decreased as well, the more power you have in the GPU as well. So that's a good question. Okay, let's see. Love the color balance tool. Please describe the difference of white balance versus color balance. That's a good one to finish in. Well, white balance is obviously achieving your perfect gray tone, if you like, and you've got your white balance picker here, so then you'd pick on your reference and then everything else would fall into line. But for this shot, if we go back to how it was shot, I feel I want something a bit cooler, just to bring out those clouds, that more angry cloud feeling going on. So white balance is the same as setting it in your camera. Now the color balance tool is great because it allows you to just either throw in a color tone that you wish over the whole shot, or it's great for creative color grading. So if we bring up our three-way section here, then you've got control over the shadows, midtones, and highlights. So if you only want to affect one area, like, oh, I just want to have colder shadows, warmer midtones, or whatever, then you can do so. Or if you feel, you know what, my shadows are looking a little bit too cool, I want to warm them up a bit, then you would just go in the opposite direction. Or if I think my midtones are too whatever, then you can go again in the opposite direction to correct it, or indeed pop in any color cast you like. So it's a really fun, versatile tool. And of course, if you put it on a layer, then you have even more versatility as well. So very simple to use. Pick up the middle point, drag it towards the color that you want to tint for the shadow, midtones, and highlights. So it's a good creative tool, but it's also good for correcting color casts over the whole shot or just over any of those areas. It also means if you had a sequence of photos and you wanted to warm them all up a bit by a tiny amount, you could do so with the color balance tool. So I could put in a correction and apply that to, you know, 50 shots or something. With the white balance tool, you can't do like a additive, just warm everything up by 50 points or whatever. It would be difficult to do that. With the color balance tool, it's super simple. Okay, all right, let's have a look at our before and after. So let's turn on before. So we've got our slider. So that's how it came out of camera. Misty, a bit too warm for my liking, and flat, and couldn't really see the angry clouds that I remembered when I looked out the car window. And then I fell out the car, choose the wrong camera settings and so on, and then we ended up with this. Now the good thing about editing with layers is that if there's anything that you think is, you know, too much, like if the radial is too strong, I could take that opacity down a bit. My highlight control's fine. If I think the clouds are too dramatic, then we can just dial that back a little bit as well. So working with layers means you've got that post-production flexibility as well. But as we said, the raw file's up for download. So go ahead and grab that and have a little play yourself as well. Great. Last question. And I'm not going to attempt to pronounce your name because I will get it wrong. Yes, you can use the color checker for accurate white balance, but that's the key thing in your question. That would be an accurate white balance, which isn't necessarily the white balance you want to have. So if we balance this shot, off the sky, which you could consider as gray. So if we grab our white balance tool once more, where are we? White balance, and said, okay, clouds are grey. Let's white balance off that. Click. Is that, oh, that's the wrong layer, David. Let's undo. Go to the background. Click. Does that look good to you? I mean, the clouds are grey now, but this is way, way, way incorrect. So often the mathematically correct grey balance is not the one that looks most pleasing to the eye. So don't forget, you can also adjust manually to suit, but that does rely on you having a calibrated monitor as well. Good question. It doesn't properly use a graphics card on a 16-inch MacBook Pro. This is a 16-inch MacBook Pro, and it definitely does. If you have any GPU issues, check out support.captureone.com, and there's a troubleshooting guide for graphics cards. So there's a couple of things you can reset that will kick it all back in nicely. But honestly, this is a 16-inch MacBook Pro, just so you see I'm not lying. You can see the graphics card there on the eGPU and the built-in chipset as well, but it works absolutely great and is actually a super nice machine. And where was this taken? We can finish on that. That was taken in, which valley was it? Somewhere in Utah is about the best I can say at the moment. If you ever get a chance to travel there, I'd well recommend it, but somewhere in Utah as well. Great. Thanks for joining today, everybody. I hope that was useful. It's a nice, fun little edit to do with some good results. So grab the file, have a try yourself, and don't forget to share your edits with Edit With Us hashtag as well on our Instagram and social media channels. So enjoy the rest of your Tuesday and hope to see you all again soon. Take care now. See you soon. Bye.